October 1944, Rainier Island, Pacific Theater. The air shook with heat and thunder. In mud that smelled of sulfur and sweat, I stood beside the 155mm G*N. The barrel screamed after every sh*T, a sound that crawled under your ribs and stayed there. Each blast peeled the air apart. The ground pulsed like a living thing. We'd been firing for hours, maybe days. Time dissolved into the rhythm of loading, aiming, firing, reloading. When I cracked open the next crate, something was wrong. Inside, the powder wasn't the standard pale gray grit. This stuff shimmered, reddish, almost alive, like rust ground too fine. The label on the drum was half torn, Lotar, TX41. I remember asking no one in particular. What the hell is that? No answer. Just rain on metal, and the impatient hiss of the G*N captain. I loaded it anyway. The breech slammed shut. The firing cord jerked. The world split open. The recoil threw dirt like surf in a storm. But when the shell hit, somewhere beyond the tree line, the jungle didn't roar. It folded. The ground moved in a way I'd never seen, like pressure pushing out from under the earth. The men stopped talking after that sh*T. I stared at the residue on my gloves, that strange red-gray dust. And I kept thinking. Why did that round hit so differently? And where, in God's name, had this powder come from? Pacific Front, U.S. 7th Army, October 1944. We were told the line was holding. That word, holding, had become the Army's favorite lie. It meant the map still looked good on a desk somewhere. It meant the statistics hadn't caught up to the smell of blood in the mud. Officially, everything ran by the manual, standard powder, regulated boosters, prescribed shell weight, no improvisation. The men at the arsenal said it kept us alive. Out here, it just kept us waiting. But quietly, in the crates that came off the supply barges, something had changed. Every third shipment carried a new stencil, Lotar, TX41. No one said what it was. No one asked. The quartermaster signed for it, the G*N stacked it, and the officers kept their silence. We were used to silence. It was the only thing the war produced in abundance. Still, the label bothered me. The letters weren't printed by the usual press, they were stamped by hand. Some barrels came with faint red streaks, as if dust had leaked through the seals. When we opened them, the powder looked wrong. Not pale yellow-gray, but dull crimson, like clay soaked in iron. The men joked it was Japanese powder captured and rebranded. Others said it was new chemical filler, stabilized nitrogen, whatever that meant. I didn't know chemistry, but I knew the smell of explosives. This one carried a strange sweetness, like old rain on copper. One night, during a lull between barrages, I watched the ordnance officer make a note on his clipboard. Batch R, TX41, performance satisfactory. Slight pressure variance. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. The next morning, we fired 20 rounds with that mix. Every one struck harder than regulation. The recoil nearly cracked the stabilizer arms. One shell vaporized a bunker that should have taken 3 direct hits. When the smoke cleared, the sergeant said, "Write that up as improved composition. Don't ask where it came from." That's how the war worked. The paperwork moved one way, up. The truth stayed buried in the mud. I didn't learn until later that the powder hadn't come from any government arsenal. Not from DuPont, not from Frankfurt, not from the chemical plants along the Delaware. Its origin traced back to a farm in Louisiana. Somewhere between a cornfield and a county fair experiment, a man had mixed the earth with nitrate and instinct, and the War Production Board had taken it. They called it an agricultural derivative. We called it miracle dirt. It burned hotter, steadier, and faster. It produced less residue, cleaner pressure curves. The G*N said it hit like thunder with manners. Command said nothing. They didn't have to. As long as the results lined up with the tables, no one cared what fed the fire. But rumors traveled faster than ships. Someone said the formula had been filed years ago under soil enrichment trials. Another swore it came from a fertilizer patent that went missing after 1942. All I knew was this: every time we loaded a TX41 shell, the ground behaved differently. The air compressed, sound folded inward, and for half a second, it felt like the island itself held its breath. By the end of the month, the old batches were gone. Everything we fired bore that same red-gray hue. The label always read the same, Lot R, TX41. Source, classified experimental stabilizer. And on paper, that was enough. The bureaucracy trusted the paperwork. The battlefield trusted results. What none of us realized then was that we were firing something born not in a laboratory, but in a barn, a farmer's stubborn experiment that had outgrown its purpose. The war machine was now fueled by soil, sweat, and accident. And somewhere, far from the front, the man who mixed that powder still believed he had invented a fertilizer. He had, only not for crops. His name was Jim Hanson. 43 years old. A farmer from Green Hill County, Louisiana, population 900, humidity constant, and soil that smelled like rust after every rain. Before the war, before letters and requisitions and classified formulas, he was just a man who fixed things. Tractors, fences, water pumps, church roofs. He had a knack for machinery that shouldn't have worked anymore. People said he had field hands with engineer's eyes. He didn't argue. His world was simple, rows of corn, diesel fumes, and the ticking patience of seasons. At dawn he'd be out behind the barn, notebook open on the tailgate of his truck, writing down whatever the earth told him that day. He called it soil notes. No one else cared. But the book grew, page after page of sketches, ratios, humidity marks, colors of dirt after rainfall. Neighbors teased him. "Jim, you still mixing that magic dust for your corn?" He'd grin and say, "Not magic. Just thinking." What he was thinking about wasn't superstition. It was chemistry by instinct. He'd noticed something small, something no agricultural bulletin had mentioned. The red clay on his land changed texture when rainwater from the iron well mixed with leftover ammonium wash. It dried slower, cracked smoother. Crops grew greener in that patch. So he started experimenting. At first, just for yield. He'd grind limestone, crush gypsum, add a scoop of nitrogen from his fertilizer stock, and stir it all with an old hand drill. The result was a gray-reddish dust that held moisture and released it slow, a kind of stabilizer for the soil. He named it after his initials and county tax code, TX41. It was never meant to destroy anything. It was meant to feed. By 1940, his corn stood taller than his neighbors by half a foot. He shared his blend in paper sacks marked, experimental feed dust. It smelled faintly metallic, but the crops didn't mind. Soon, word reached the county agricultural board. They sent a man with a clipboard who asked questions Jim couldn't fully answer. Composition? Mostly nitrate, a little calcium, trace iron, Jim said. Source of nitrate? Leftover from last year's fertilizer drum. Heated to dry it faster. That was enough to make the man raise an eyebrow. Heating nitrate. Mixing it with metal dust. The kind of thing no manual recommended. But the yield spoke louder than warnings. When the report reached Baton Rouge, someone in the state agriculture office filed it under Stable Nitrogen Blend, Soil Preservation. Then, when war came, the War Production Board scoured every archive for anything containing the word stable nitrogen. That's how a farmer's soil recipe ended up in a government memo titled Potential Explosive Derivative, Evaluate for Booster Application. Jim didn't know. He kept farming. He planted, recorded rainfall, and tinkered with his tractor's carburetor. Once, a traveling preacher told him God blesses the hands that work the ground. Jim smiled politely, thinking that God had little to do with nitrogen levels. He never sought patents or profit. His invention lived in a tin coffee can beside the tool rack, labeled in pencil. The first time he realized it was gone, months later, he assumed his brother had borrowed it. Only later did he notice the men from Baton Rouge had stopped by when he was out in the East Field. They'd asked his wife about his formulas. She told them to check the barn. By then, the samples were already on a train headed north. To a laboratory that saw in his fertilizer what he never had, a new way to make things burn clean. When letters came from Washington asking for clarification, he thought they were joking. Dear Mr. Hanson, regarding your TX41 compound, please specify drying temperature and storage tolerance. He wrote back on lined paper. I dry mine at room heat, keep it in coffee tins. Works best when damp. Somewhere in an office, that last line must have made an engineer pause. Because within weeks, another letter came, stamped confidential. Jim Hanson wasn't a scientist. He was a man who listened to dirt. But the dirt had started to whisper to men who built we*P*NS. He had no idea the powder that once made corn rise straighter would soon make the ground itself tremble. By the autumn of 1941, the war had reached even Green Hill County, though no one there had heard a bomb. The local paper still printed crop prices beside headlines about Europe burning. Gasoline rationing came first, then the metal drives. And slowly, quietly, the war began collecting men. I remember the morning they took my nephew. The army truck rumbled off, leaving dust on the porch. My sister cried. I went back to the barn. Work didn't stop just because the world had. But the soil was changing. The year before, I'd switched to a new commercial fertilizer, higher yield, they promised. It did the opposite. The corn came up thin, pale, brittle as paper. The ground cracked open like old paint. Something in that blend burned the life out of the land. I tried to fix it. Not by the book, by feel. I mixed the leftover fertilizer with lime, then added fine ground clay from the well pit. It didn't explode, didn't smoke, didn't even fizz. It just settled, warm and quiet, like good bread dough. I wrote in my notebook, holds moisture evenly, smell sharp but clean. That smell would later fill entire munitions warehouses. Neighbors kept their distance. One old man said I was boiling the devil's stew. Another laughed and told me to patent it before I blew up the county. They didn't understand, I wasn't chasing money, just trying to keep the land breathing. But late that year, I noticed something strange. When the blend sat too long in damp air, the color deepened to rust red. I left a sample near the stove to dry, it crusted over, fine as G*powder, and when I tapped it with a wrench, it sparked. Just a flicker. Enough to make me step back. I should have stopped. I didn't. By December, the news of Pearl Harbor came through the battery radio. The world snapped open. Every headline screamed war. Even in Louisiana, you could feel it, trains screaming at night, fields abandoned, men disappearing into uniforms. In February, a county agent came to survey farms for nitrate quotas. He saw my jars lined up on the shelf, labeled TX41, TX42, TX43, each a slight change in ratio. He took one, smiled politely, and said, "We're gathering samples for the War Production Board. They're looking for ways to stretch supplies." I thought nothing of it. I had no idea that in wartime, every grain of nitrogen was gold. It fed crops. It fed shells. And whoever controlled it, controlled the scale of destruction. 3 months later, I got a letter from Washington asking for details. It didn't say fertilizer. It said stabilizer compound. I stared at the word for a long time. Then another letter came, this one from a man who signed only with initials. He asked if I'd ever heated the mix before storage. I wrote back, only to dry it. A week later, 2 men in gray suits and government badges arrived. They asked to see the process. One took photographs, the other collected samples. They said phrases like yield consistency and combustion profile. I told them it wasn't meant to burn. They said everything burns if you look hard enough. When they left, the barn felt empty, like something had been taken besides powder. The following month, I received a typed report with a government seal. Preliminary analysis of TX41 compound indicates exceptional stability under compression. Potential applications under review. I didn't understand the language, but I knew tone. It wasn't written by farmers. Soon, more letters arrived. They asked for measurements, drying times, composition percentages. I answered with what I knew. After that, silence. Then the newspapers began printing new slogans, "Every farm a factory for freedom." That's when I realized they'd found a use for my dust. Men in town started saying the war needed all kinds of miracles, radar, rockets, bombs that never misfired. I listened, but said nothing. I knew part of one of those miracles was sitting in my barn, half a sack left over from the last batch. I buried it behind the corn bins. Later that winter, the sheriff told me the government had posted a notice, certain chemical compounds requisitioned for defense production. My formula number was on it, TX41. They never asked for permission. They didn't need it. A few months after that, the first explosion at an arsenal in Texas was reported. They called it an experimental misfire. I folded the newspaper and put it in my soil notes, next to the line I'd written 2 years earlier, smell sharp but clean. That smell was no longer mine. By 1943, my name had vanished from the papers. Whatever the War Production Board was doing with TX41, it had moved far beyond my reach. I was back on the farm, mending fences, counting seasons. But sometimes the wind carried a sound that didn't belong, a low, distant hum like a train that never arrived. Testing grounds, maybe. I didn't ask. Then came the telegram. From Riverside Arsenal, Texas. Subject, material evaluation request. They wanted me to come. Not to farm, to fix. The arsenal was enormous, a city of steel and thunder. Barrels of powder stacked like silos, rail lines cutting through the dust, workers moving in white coveralls under signs that said keep dry, keep safe. When I stepped out of the truck, the air burned with nitrate and oil. An engineer met me at the gate, a pale man with horn-rimmed glasses and a face powdered white from the dust. "You're the farmer," he said, not asking. "They told me you understand this compound." I didn't answer. I just nodded and followed. Inside the main building, they showed me rows of drums labeled TX41, my handwriting copied perfectly by stencil. But something was wrong. The powder clumped like wet flour. The air smelled off, sweet and sour, like rotting fruit. The supervisor slammed his clipboard. Unstable. The moisture content's climbing. "We've had 2 barrels fail the burn test." I asked how they stored it. "In these bunkers, of course," he said. "Controlled humidity, 28% average." I looked at the concrete walls, sweating. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. I rubbed a finger along the floor, it came up damp. The room breathed water. "It's not the mix," I said quietly. "It's the room." He frowned. "What? You can't dry bread in a wet oven." That line earned me a few stares, a few laughs. But I saw the truth in the powder. It wasn't failing, it was suffocating. The TX41 compound fed on equilibrium. When air turned heavy, it trapped moisture, held it like soil before rain. In a farm shed, that was life. In an arsenal, it was death waiting for spark. The supervisor barked at his men to stop production. Workers froze mid-step, clipboard to clipboard. One young chemist whispered, "You saying the army built this whole setup wrong?" I said nothing. I just pointed at the ceiling, where water dripped into an open drum. Within hours, the line shut down. Trains idled outside, waiting for powder that wouldn't come. Schedules burned like wasted paper. The officer in charge demanded answers from Washington. Washington demanded answers from the scientists. The scientists demanded them from me. They called me to the lab that night. I sat under bright lamps while a dozen engineers questioned every step of my original process. I told them again and again, TX41 must dry in open air. Sunlight. Low humidity. Never sealed too soon. They didn't like that answer. It wasn't procedural. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't war. One colonel slammed his fist on the table. "We can't fight battles on farmers' luck." I looked at him. "Then stop storing powder like wet seed." Silence. At midnight, they sent a truck to move the barrels into a hangar heated by old aircraft engines. I waited with them, hands black with dust, listening to the hum of the fans. After 3 days, we retested the samples. Every one burned clean, no flare, no residue. The supervisor didn't thank me. He just checked his clipboard and muttered, "Production resumes Monday." Before I left, one engineer, younger, nervous, caught me outside. "You saved this project," he said. But you broke every rule in the book doing it. I told him I hadn't read the book. He laughed once, without humor. That's exactly the problem. I drove home under a sky that glowed faintly from the testing fields. In the mirror, the light pulsed, steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something larger than men. I didn't know it then, but the next time that glow appeared on the horizon, it wouldn't be in Texas. It would be across the Pacific, born from my soil, my stubbornness, and the Army's faith in paperwork. And it would not be testing anymore. The morning after the retest, they called me back to the line. The air in the production hall was thick with relief and exhaustion. Fans rattled. Drums thudded down conveyor rails. Men moved faster now, their faces streaked with powder. Someone had scribbled in chalk across a wall, "Keep it dry, Hanson's Law." I didn't know whether to laugh or curse. An officer with a clipboard met me near the loading ramp. "You'll stay until output stabilizes," he said. "You understand this stuff better than we do." "I understand dirt," I told him. "This is something else." But they didn't hear me. The war didn't slow for philosophy. In the lab, I asked to see the storage logs. The clerk hesitated. Civilians weren't supposed to touch records, but by now even the colonel knew procedure had already failed once. So they let me. I flipped through the papers. Temperature readings, humidity levels, test pressures. Numbers that looked neat enough to fool anyone sitting behind a desk. Yet I saw the pattern. Every failed batch came from Bunker C, the only room built below ground. Damp by design. The others, raised on steel grids, performed perfectly. "It's not chemistry," I said. "It's architecture." The engineers exchanged glances. One muttered, "He's guessing." Another whispered, "He's right." I told them to move all TX-41 drums out of Bunker C, dry the walls with portable heaters, scrape the condensation from the pipes, then start over. The safety officer said that was impossible without a formal order. I told him the powder didn't care about paperwork. The colonel glared at me. "You don't give orders here." "No," I said. "But your men are the ones standing next to those barrels." That ended the argument. They began the transfer that afternoon. Workers rolled drums through the dust while I stood by the door, counting each one. A forklift driver shouted over the engine noise, "What do we tell the inspectors?" "Tell them the farmer said the dirt was wrong." By nightfall, the heaters roared inside the new shed. The powder smell thickened, sharp, metallic, alive. When they ran the first ignition test, the flame burned blue-white, clean as lightning. The technician looked up from his stopwatch and whispered, "Perfect curve." Someone clapped. Someone else crossed himself. The colonel didn't speak. He just nodded once and walked out. That's how the TX-41 line restarted, on the word of a man with calloused hands and no clearance. Against protocol. Against logic. But it worked. 2 weeks later, production exceeded target. The arsenal sent crates north, stamped with my initials though my name appeared nowhere. Each shell bore the quiet evidence of disobedience, the ghost of a drying shed that shouldn't have existed. Before I left, the younger engineer, the one who'd spoken to me before, found me by the loading platform. "They're rewriting the manual," he said. "They'll call it environmental stabilization. You'll get no credit, of course." "I don't need credit," I told him. "Just make sure they don't build any more wet ovens." He smiled, thin and tired. "You really think this mix is safe?" "No," I said. "Just understood." The next morning, a military truck drove me back to the station. I carried no papers, only the notebook they'd returned, soil notes, pages smudged from too many hands. On the last page, I wrote one line before the train pulled out, "When the ground won't hold, you change the ground." Behind me, Riverside Arsenal shimmered under the heat. Barrels glinted like water in the sun. Somewhere in that maze of concrete and noise, the line kept running, pouring my red-gray dust into casings that would cross oceans. I remember the sound, steady, rhythmic, almost peaceful. Like a field engine running true. But beneath it all was something colder, the knowledge that I had taught the Army how to fix my mistake, and in doing so, made it unstoppable. Rules had been written to prevent men like me from touching their machines. I had touched them anyway. And for the first time, the war machine purred instead of coughed. That was the moment I understood what real disobedience cost. It wasn't punishment. It was ownership. Every shell they made after that carried my fingerprint, invisible but permanent, a trace of rain, clay, and human arrogance. And it was too late to take it back. 6 months later, I learned where the powder had gone. A letter from an ordnance officer arrived, typed in the gray ink of military comm, TX-41 batch performing within superior range. Field results classified but satisfactory. There was no signature. Just a date, October 1944. That same week, a photograph appeared in a newspaper. Black and white, grainy. A group of artillerymen stood behind a massive G*N on a jungle island, the caption reading, 7th Army, Rainier Operation. I stared at the picture for a long time. The barrel markings were faint, but there it was, our TX-41. My soil turned into thunder. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of rain on metal and wondered if someone, somewhere, was loading that same red-gray powder into another shell, unaware of what it could do. Later reports filtered back through rumors and half-truths. The first combat test had come during a siege on Rainier Island, a fortress of rock and coral the Japanese had turned into a labyrinth. The standard bombardments had done nothing. The shells bounced, fragmented, died in the sand. Then the TX-41 rounds arrived. The G*N crews didn't know what they were firing. They just saw the crates stamped experimental stabilizer. They loaded, fired, and watched the impossible happen. The first volley struck the ridge line. Instead of a single explosion, there was a rolling concussion that flattened palm trees half a mile away. The blast didn't just tear, it pressed. It pushed. It crushed the air itself. Marines on the far beach said it felt like the sky had folded. After the 4th *T, the entire hillside collapsed. Bunkers that had withstood months of shelling caved in like wet cardboard. The shockwave traveled underground, bursting through ventilation shafts, choking defenders with smoke before the fire reached them. By nightfall, the position was gone. The radio men called it pressure thunder. The G*Ners called it the quiet quake. A field report, later buried under layers of classification, described it in numbers: peak overpressure recorded at 17 psi. Ground resonance sustained for 2.3 seconds. To anyone else, that was data. To me, it was the echo of a barn in Louisiana, a drying shed, a mistake turned into doctrine. One Marine sergeant, interviewed weeks later, said, "The ground hit back. You could feel it in your ribs." After the third volley, the jungle stopped shooting. He didn't know he was describing fertilizer. The success of Rainier changed everything. Command ordered mass production of the compound. The words, experimental, and temporary, vanished from the memos. The new order read, adopt TX-41 for high-stability booster application. Immediate. Factories across the country began copying the process I'd once done by hand. They replaced my shovel with mixers, my coffee tins with silos. The blend that had once fit in my palm now poured by the ton. On the battlefield, it became a legend, the powder that never failed in humidity, that cut through bunkers like wire through clay. Artillerymen stopped calling it TX-41. They gave it a soldier's nickname, cornfire. Some swore it burned cleaner, that it didn't leave smoke to reveal their positions. Others said it smelled like rain. One report claimed the recoil patterns were smoother, that G*NS stayed balanced longer. I knew why: the compound burned with an even compression curve, almost gentle in its violence. They said it saved lives. They said it ended sieges faster. They said it shortened the war. I didn't know whether to believe them. Because in every photograph, in every smiling face behind a 155mm G*N, I could see the same residue, that faint reddish dust clinging to the steel. My dust. The engineers at Riverside wrote their final note on the project: booster performance acceptable. Continue production. That was the end of the file. But out there, across 1,000 miles of ocean, the end was only beginning. I sometimes imagine the sound, that pressure folding air, the earth flexing, trees turning to ash. A miracle born from moisture control and stubborn logic. And I wonder, each time I hear thunder in the distance, whether it's the sky reminding me that nothing we make to feed the ground ever truly stops there. Because once the soil learns to burn, it never forgets. When the fighting ended, the report stopped coming. No more letters from Texas, no more requests for clarification, no more engineers asking how long to dry the mix. The war had eaten its fill. I thought, for a time, that the dust might settle. It didn't. The first notice came from a clerk in Washington. A small envelope, plain, addressed in careful type. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Your compound TX41 has proven effective. Production concluded. Thank you for your cooperation. No signature, no emblem, just that. I read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table while the radio hummed with news of victory parades. My wife brought me coffee. She asked if it meant they would pay. I said no. The army didn't pay for accidents. For weeks afterward, the fields outside felt wrong. Too quiet. The wind didn't smell of rain anymore. When I turned the soil, it came up lighter, as if it had given something away. I told myself I was imagining it, that war couldn't reach this far inland. But the truth was simpler: once your work has burned across the world, the ground never feels honest again. A month later, I drove to town to collect feed. On the bulletin board outside the post office, someone had pinned a newspaper clipping from the Pacific Front. Rainier secured, enemy surrenders after intense bombardment. The photo showed men cheering beside the same G*NS that had once fired my soil. I pulled the clipping down and folded it into my pocket before anyone saw. At night, I sat on the porch with a lamp and my old notebook. Soil notes. The pages were brittle now, corners singed from a welding torch years back. On the last line I'd ever written, the ink had bled from sweat, holds moisture evenly, smells sharp but clean. I almost tore it out. Instead, I closed the cover and slid it under the floorboard. Some knowledge wasn't meant to survive peace. By winter, letters began appearing in scientific journals, anonymous reports about low-residue propellants and controlled pressure combustion. I recognized my ratios hidden in their numbers. No one mentioned me, of course. They didn't have to. Every formula carried my handwriting in the margins, even when rewritten by professionals. One afternoon, a train passed through town, hauling crates stamped ordnance return. Red dust leaked from a seam, scattering across the gravel. I caught a handful. It still smelled the same, like iron after rain. That night, I told my wife, funny thing, sometimes the soil ends up fighting wars. She looked at me for a long moment and said softly, and does it win them? I didn't answer. The following spring, the government auctioned surplus materials from the Riverside Arsenal. I received a notice offering me the chance to purchase obsolete agricultural derivatives at reduced cost. I burned it in the stove. Years later, a stranger visited, an engineer in a gray suit. He said he'd worked under one of the men who'd tested TX41. He thanked me for saving lives. I told him I hadn't saved anything. I just kept the powder dry. He smiled the way people do when they don't understand. Before leaving, he asked if I still had the formula. I said no. He looked disappointed, but relieved, as if my denial absolved him of something. After he left, I walked out to the barn. The walls still carried faint stains where the coffee tins once sat. I brushed a finger across the wood, the red dust rose like smoke. They had written performance acceptable and closed the file. But every storm that rolled across the delta still sounded like artillery to me. The war was over. The land was quiet. And yet I could never stand near thunder without thinking of pressure curves and burn rates, of how the ground had once obeyed me. The lesson was simple, though I never wrote it down. When you teach the earth to make fire, don't be surprised when it no longer waits for rain. After the war, the world exhaled. Ships came home, banners fluttered, parades filled the streets. Men returned in uniforms now faded by salt and time. I went back to Green Hill County. No parade waited there, only silence and the smell of wet soil. The farm was smaller than I remembered. The fields had gone feral during those years. Weeds rose taller than the fence posts, and the plowshares were red with rust. I spent the first month cleaning, the next trying to forget. But memory is like moisture, it seeps back through any wall you build. Neighbors came to shake my hand. Some had sons who'd fought in the Pacific. They told me stories about islands I'd only seen on maps, about shells that hit like thunder and left craters deep enough to fill with rain. They didn't know that the red-gray dust inside those shells had once dried on my porch. I listened, nodded, and said nothing. The government never mentioned me. No medal, no citation, not even a line in a report. The formula existed, but the man behind it had been erased. That was fine. I'd always preferred working in silence. What unsettled me wasn't being forgotten, it was knowing the dust wasn't. In 1947, a friend who worked at an army depot in Illinois mailed me an old file folder. Inside, yellowed papers stamped Riverside Arsenal, archive copy. He'd found it in a stack marked, obsolete. The cover read, TX41, Farmer Additive. I turned each page slowly. There were diagrams of combustion chambers, humidity charts, even a photograph of my barn from before the war, taken by some government surveyor without my knowing. At the back was a note in pencil, retest for long-term storage. Potential secondary use in propellant stabilization. They hadn't buried it. They'd only paused. I placed the file in a metal box with my wife's letters and locked it away. The world was already moving toward new P***NS, brighter ones, cleaner ones. My mixture would live on, not as powder, but as principle. Years later, when I read about rockets launched from White Sands and Nevada, I recognized the phrasing, thermal consistency under variable humidity. That was TX41 talking in another tongue. By the 1950s, my hands had stiffened from arthritis. I couldn't mix soil anymore, but sometimes I'd crumble a clod between my fingers just to feel the grit. The earth still smelled faintly metallic in spring, like memory. Once, a reporter came through the county writing a feature about local innovations that aided victory. He asked if I'd heard of a man named Hanson who'd invented a stabilizer powder. I told him no. He thanked me and drove on. I watched his car disappear down the dirt road, dust trailing like smoke. In the years that followed, people forgot how close the war had come to consuming everything. But in certain laboratories, in climate-controlled bunkers, they remembered. They used my ratios, inverted, modernized, stripped of name, to line missile silos and preserve munitions. They called it stabilized substrate layering. Once, in 1963, a young technician from Baton Rouge wrote to ask if I'd ever observed nitrate fatigue in humid environments. He must have found my old correspondence in a file. I wrote back one sentence, only when the air remembers rain. He never replied. By the time I turned 70, the farm was quiet again. My wife had passed. The machines slept under tarps. Some nights, when storms rolled over the bayou, lightning would flash and I'd see the fields light up in sheets of white, as if the ground itself were returning fire. When I died, the newspaper gave me 5 lines. James Edwin Hanson, farmer, tinkerer, man of quiet patience. No mention of shells. No mention of TX41. But somewhere, in a locked archive at Riverside Arsenal, the folder remains. I imagine dust gathering on it the way it once gathered on my hands. Engineers still consult it, not knowing the face behind the ink. That's legacy enough. Because invention doesn't remember names, only consequences. And every time the ground shakes with thunder, a small part of that old dust wakes up again, whispering that the soil never stopped fighting. He never set out to change the world. He only wanted his corn to grow. But the soil remembered him. It carried his curiosity into the furnaces of war, turned patience into pressure, fertilizer into fire. On Rainier Island, in the echo of every shell, his field spoke, not in words, but in the language of shock and silence. No one in Green Hill County ever knew. To them he was just Jim Hanson, the quiet farmer with ink-stained hands. Yet half a world away, the ground still trembled with his logic, that stubborn refusal to accept what failed, that instinct to fix what shouldn't be touched. He just wanted to save his crops. And in doing so, he taught the earth to burn. And helped win the war.